Hello and welcome back to the Nietzsche Book Club. This is Byron Goatman here with my friend Nate, and we're here to continue our Nietzsche series, specifically for the Genealogy and Morals. As we left off last time, we were partway through the first essay, which focuses on the distinction of the noble and ignoble modes of evaluation, specifically noble versus slave morality, the good versus bad distinction versus the good versus evil distinction. And one of the main things that we noticed is it felt as if Nietzsche didn't have a very specific embodiment of the noble ideal, as if he was lacking a specific reference, as if this was more of an ideal that was ungrounded in specific personage that he could emulate. Maybe he had a psychological ideal for himself. And to start that off, I wanted to read two paragraphs relevant that give specific examples of what Nietzsche considers noble ideals in relatively recent history. There was, to be sure, in the Renaissance an uncanny and glittering reawakening of the classical ideal of the noble mode of evaluating all things. Rome itself, oppressed by the new superimposed Judaized Rome that presented the aspect of an ecumenical synagogue and was called the Church, stirred like one awakened from seeming death. But Judea immediately triumphed again, thanks to that thoroughly plebeian German and English ressentiment movement called the Reformation, and to that which was bound to arise from it, the restoration of the Church. The restoration, too, with the ancient sepulchral repose of classical Rome. So here we see that the Renaissance is one of Nietzsche's examples of the noble ideal apart from certain figures of classical times. And so, Nate, I want to ask you specifically.
The Renaissance, that's still not a person.
Well, sure. I suppose you're thinking of maybe specific people in the Renaissance, or...
Yeah, it's so vague.
I guess.
That's still not an example at all. We already knew he was referring to the Greek and classic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that doesn't help at all.
So in the next paragraph, he does mention his specific person, presumably maybe his best recent example of the noble ideal. With the French Revolution, Judea once again triumphed over the classical ideal, and this time in an even more profound and decisive sense. The last political noblesse in Europe, that of the French 17th and 18th century, collapsed beneath the popular instincts of ressentiment. Greater rejoicing, more uproarious enthusiasm had never been heard on earth. To be sure, in the midst of it there occurred the great, most tremendous, the most unexpected thing. The ideal of antiquity itself stepped incarnate in an unheard-of splendor before the eyes and conscience of mankind, and once again, in opposition to the mendacious slogan of ressentiment, supreme rights of the majority, in opposition to the will of the lowering, the abasement, the leveling, and the decline and twilight of mankind, there sounded stronger, simpler, and more insistently than ever the terrible and rapturous counter-slogan, supreme rights of the few. Like a last signpost to the other path, Napoleon appeared, the most isolated and late-born man there has ever been, and in him the problem of the noble ideal as such made flesh. One might well ponder what kind of problem it is. Napoleon, the synthesis of the inhuman and superhuman. So it seems as if Nietzsche has a very positive interpretation of the man Napoleon Bonaparte the First, and so I'm not sure what to think of it. My intuition is that if I looked more into the history of Napoleon, I would find him to be, dishonest at least some of the time to achieve his goals. And, in war, that's fair enough to do. But, I'm not sure, I don't think the French people would have consented to the program that he implemented over time if they knew what he was going to do. Probably the original impetus was that France was under attack, from so many nations, and they needed a great defender against them. And Napoleon did accomplish that mission, but I'm convinced that Napoleon or France could have chilled out at some point, probably before 1812 or before they attacked Russia and Portugal, They probably could have chilled out by then and be like, okay, we made a lot of progress. Let's just stop here and let's try to make a permanent, sustainable treaty with the French and just kind of sit back or something, peacefully develop. But Napoleon wanted to try too hard to defeat a naval power without his own navy, and so he insisted on enforcing the trade embargo on countries like Russia and Portugal, and that got him into so many conflicts, and he lost so many soldiers, and his supply chains were so drawn out that it definitely led to his eventual defeat by 1814. So that's my assessment. I think Napoleon probably does represent a lot of good traits, but we have to acknowledge also his mistakes. But anyway, this is more supposed to be about Nietzsche's noble ideal, and I want to see what commentary you'd have to add.
Yeah, I mean, I think if that's his example of noble, that goes to show that his whole ideal is incredibly flawed, in my opinion. I mean, yeah, like concretely, I think there is a better example of like a noble king that's alive today. This is not necessarily a popular opinion in the West, but I think Vladimir Putin is like a much better example of a nobleman than Napoleon. Napoleon, he's very very flashy, and he cited a lot of like ancient culture, and he created this image around himself. But Napoleon's not all that different from like a figure like Hitler, where they thrive on destroying others, on conquering. It's really no different psychologically than like that like schoolyard bully who kind of like needs to bring down others to feel good about themselves, in my opinion. Of course, it's like a very flashy, like perhaps even elegant schoolyard bully, not just like the dirty thug, I guess. But even still, like if you look at like Vladimir Putin, he had like a speech maybe a year ago or something, and he talks about his idea of like civilization, and he says the defining feature of civilization is self-sufficiency. He's like, we don't, this war in Ukraine, we're not trying to like gain territory. We already got plenty of territory. We're just like trying to maintain our own boundaries. If whether you believe it or not, that's up to you. I don't really care. But this principle of and I think it's the same as like individual people. It's like we could live in a world where everybody is just confident to be themselves, like do the kinds of things they want to do. You don't have to like give into like obligations that you don't want, and if you kind of like are trying to do the things you want to do, like, well, you'll express your joy from that. You'll find the people that also like to do these kinds of things. But in terms of a national level, it's like, if you listen to Putin also, like he'll say like, look, all the countries no country is like better than another. They're all equal. They're all different but equal. Because where culture comes from, essentially like culture and civilization, it's rooted in history, and it's also rooted in the geography of the location. That's, and that like original like geographical differences, that gives birth to the culture that then, flourishes in all these different ways. So in this sense, they must be different. But they can be equal also in the sense that, there is like a common human condition, and they can all be like sort of commonly trying to maintain their boundaries. So I think this is a very good philosophy. Like you don't have to be colonial to survive. You can be self-sufficient. The earth you can make enough food and, you know, be happy enough. There's always going to be conflicts at the borders. But that's not like but you know, that's not, it doesn't have to be like a conquering kind of thing to where you're dependent, you're actually dependent on taking from them. No, it's more like the you know, the principle of self-defense, you know. So I agree with that principle personally.
Okay.
Well.
So would you say that Putin specifically fits the Nietzschean definition of noble or a different definition?
I think Nietzsche is very inconsistent, to be totally honest. Because in some passages he'll really imply, you know, like the one we read last week, he's like, the noblemen trust themselves and it's open. And then in another passage he's really implying that it's like, just like, whoever can conquer these weak losers is like, I mean, that's my interpretation, is noble. Just not being weak is noble. It's like totally, it's you know, I think he's very inconsistent. His emotions are all over the place. From what I can see.
For me, when I read the first essay, I really emphasized this idea of the nobles being honest, and the nobles would not like suppress their emotions, and it would be the weak people or the not ignoble people who would, you know, suppress their feelings and tell lies. And so, you know, for the way I emphasize with my interpretation of Nietzsche's noble ideal, then if I had to use the Nietzschean standard on Putin, then the question is Putin honest or is Putin dishonest?
Well, one thing that's unique about Putin is if you watch his interviews or like the speech, like after the speech at the Valdai conference, he did a Q&A, and you know, people asked him these very challenging questions of all sorts, and he answers them off the top of his head using his own knowledge. And he's like, clearly, you know, sometimes he'll cite history, sometimes he'll give a very like scientific understanding about how world economics works, and it's all like he's just saying, he's explaining it to them. It's like as if it's the explanation of somebody who actually knows something, who's just explaining it to someone.
Sure.
And he has no fear to answer. Now, I mean, sometimes you can, like, I think sometimes, you know, people may ask him the kind of question that he can't answer. Like, if you asked him, like, what's your military strategy? He answers by saying, you know, like, no, that, like, I can't tell you that. And other times, you know, people may ask him, another question where he has to, like, say, you know, as my role of president of Russia, you know, I, like, doesn't make sense for me to tell this to you. But that's not a dishonesty, that's just saying,
That's,
you know, if, like,
honest.
if somebody asked, so that's the impression I get, I think.
Sure. Do you think that you think he expresses himself openly, like in an emotional way? Like
he's open about, you know, in an emotional way. I mean, he definitely keeps a pretty calm demeanor. I mean, he's not shy about like calling people out in that sense.
Right. I've seen that.
But I don't know too much about that, to be honest.
I think at least we can say that he's not like burning with ressentiment. Like, at least we're getting the impression that he's not swelling up with ressentiment. Yeah. Like Nietzsche's slave.
And I mean, to clarify too, it's like, I'm not a Russian. I'm not a follower of Putin. I'm not like, I'm not, he's his own guy with his own country. But I mean, you can still have this, I can still like respect that. And I have the view that, like, you know, if our leaders in the West and if our attitude shifted more towards that, I could see there being more peaceful world situation. You know, and you can actually, instead of, because right now, you know, what America's been doing is trying to kind of infects other countries and brings them to our culture of consumerism, you know?
Sure.
Which is kind of, it's, you know, sad for me to see, like, for example, a country like India that has such a long heritage and so much culture, having like shopping malls, and it's just not a good look, you know. But it's been kind of forced on them to a large extent. So yeah, I think, and that's not the kind of world I want to live in. It's not visually stimulating. It's not culturally. It's not intellectually stimulating. I like diversity. So that's my view.
Sure. I think, you know, we'd be better off if our politicians were more honest. So, for example, if our politicians were more honest and lived closer to this Nietzschean ideal of the noble, then they would admit that we don't have enough money to pay for all this stuff that people want. You know, I think we live in a fake economy, and I think we're propped up through artificial methods like monetary manipulation and you know, other things in the financial system that allow us to have a false sense of prosperity. I think the idea that we were able to like outsource our jobs, for example, was dependent on the fakeness of our own economy. I think the idea of a service economy is partially like a lie. I don't think service economies themselves are enough to generate enough value to get concrete goods in return, overall at least. But anyway, that's not my intended focus for the video. So to be fair, there's not much else to say about Nietzsche's first essay for me. And you know, if you have anything else you want to say about the first essay, let me know. But,
well, unfortunately for the audience, you know, I brought even more negativity this time.
Yeah, it's
just to clarify.
He's like a Hegel himself. He just brings the negativity.
Yep.
I guess Nietzsche's a negative guy as well, but
yeah, I mean, that's really what my negativity is about also.
Sure.
Reading, you know, when I first started reading this, I mean, I'll admit, like, I think this book is refreshing in comparison to Hegel. I think Hegel is just a pile of nonsense. Well, I mean, there's actually there's a logic to it, but I mean, Hegel's kind of writing from the perspective. He's like the ego that's like trying to understand the world and to control its power and, you know, control other people as much as possible too. And I think it's almost like an honest account of that, of that attitude or strategy or whatever it is, psychological condition. So it is honest, but like, I don't know, it's so like, but like we were saying too with Hegel, like I do think maybe there's something where you can't like allow yourself to be fully aware of what you're doing. You can't like think that you're a bad person. So I think that's where the sort of obfuscation comes from. So it does appear to me as very obfuscated, though I think to some extent it's kind of an honest account. But anyways, I don't enjoy that. This is more interesting. It's got like stimulating ideas. And when I first started reading it, you know, I see Nietzsche's his criticisms and his like brutal honesty, and I thought it was refreshing. But you know, when I was reading this yesterday, I just really started to see like it for what it really is, which is just the rant of a just bitter, angry, hateful, cynical man. You know, not that he's like inherently hateful, but he's filled with hate. You know, I wrote like one thing in the margin, which was because, you know, in this first essay towards the end, he's dissing on this type of weak person. And we can come back to this because I think he has a valid criticism. But what I wrote in the margin was, you know, Nietzsche is filled with hatred because he himself feels weak. And I kind of believe that. I mean, that's the only way I could understand his rant, his hatred for the weak the way it is, as if he himself feels weak. He was unable to achieve his like happiness, and he really hates himself, and he's projecting that out. So that's kind of my. Of course, it's mixed in with some legitimate theories, but even those, I mean, I think he is a bit inconsistent. You know, I think there's some things I could point out where I kind of disagree with it, or I think he's contradicting something else he might have said. But the main point is just like, what's his emotions, what's his attitude, he's not happy, I think he's a brilliant guy, but like, he's not brilliant enough to reach his own happiness. And because of that, he kind of is spreading sort of toxic emotions, in my opinion. So that's what I was getting.
I mean, I guess I'll concede that, I do consider Nietzsche to have been an unhappy person, but, a very intelligent person, a very profound person, very knowledgeable, and so I feel like there's still value in what he's written, and it's a lot easier to access that value compared to Hegel due to the writing style, but I do have to concede that, his writings have influenced me to where I perceive things, negatively, where, I now perceive cruelty, and I think about cruelty more than I otherwise would have because of Nietzsche's influence. And that's going to be more relevant when we get to the second essay.
Yeah, another thing I started doing, some notes I started taking, was there were a couple points, like some of the points he makes. I think there exist other books that sort of get to a similar point, but in a much more productive way. For example, at one point he asks, what light does linguistics, and especially the study of etymology, throw in the history of the evolution of moral concepts? And I was saying, consider a book like 1984. It sort of talks about a similar issue, but I think in a much more productive way. I mean, of course, that came after the fact. It's not exactly a comparison. I'm just saying, for nourishing myself, I may, read a book like that, get some similar ideas, but, not be infected by so much vitriol. And then another, in the next, at the beginning of the second essay, he said, there was a quote, there could be no happiness, no cheerfulness, no hope, no pride, no present without forgetfulness. But he's saying this, he's ranting in his kind of angry way. There's a book, In Praise of Folly, by Erasmus, where he's kind of he makes the same point, but it's in this, satirical way and comedic way. That's actually, you get the same point, but actually it's really positive, actually.
I mean, okay, I didn't really interpret that part so cynically. I mean, I was I think if you just give it an honest chance, it doesn't have to be that way.
His whole frame of reference is just negative, though.
Well, maybe so. I'm just saying that, for that specific part, if you try to think about all the times you were happy, you had to also forget the times that things were really bad.
No, this is exactly my point. I'm not disagreeing with the truth of the statement. I'm disagreeing with the attitude. You can put the same truth in a totally different context, and it changes everything. The truth In Praise of Folly makes the exact same statement from a logical perspective, but the presentation is much more nourishing and positive, in my opinion.
Now, to be fair, I haven't read that book,
Yeah.
so I don't know how I judge it.
But that's just a way I would sort of, say, criticize Nietzsche. I mean, it's like, you don't even, because I'm basically making the point, you don't even need this. There exist other books with the same information that are more spiritually nourishing, in my opinion. And I really believe that. You know, I really believe that.
I mean, I feel like I've noticed in myself like a craving for negativity, and you know, we were talking outside of this video, and you know, Nate wants to read like a different type of book. He said more wholesome, and like I was struggling to think of a book that I want to read that like fits that criteria. Because like I think I made progress, but for me, like I used to think of happy people as like dishonest or foolish or something like that. I thought there was something wrong with happy people or optimistic people. I thought optimism was inaccurate. And like, so there's some type of pleasure I get out of the negativity of this book. And so, and I think negative content like serves a function, and I think like it's not completely bad to produce negative content. Now, I think Nietzsche would be part of this, one of the victims of the death of God, as much as he was someone who wrote about it. And so
We need to distinguish different forms of negativity.
okay.
For example, like, if you're pointing out a contradiction, you know, let's say a logical contradiction in something someone says, you could call that negativity. Or like, you determine something is logically untrue. And I kind of, you know, I think that's important and productive and absolutely necessary. For example, you know, but there's a different negativity, which is like various like negative emotions, which is different because you can take the same logical statement, be it like it's truth statement or falsity statement, and present it with different emotions, you know. It's like if you have a relationship with a partner, you know, they say sometimes, you know, if you can tell you have something to share, you know, you got to be aware of like, is this a bad time to share it? Maybe I should wait, or maybe I should, you know. And it's not like you're hiding anything, you know. It's just like sometimes you can be in this state where if you share it, you're just going to make things worse. Whereas if you're a bit cooled off, you can share the same thing and it maybe work through. So I think it's a similar principle. So we need to distinguish these. Because for example, like the book I was talking about, In Praise of Folly, it's a book of satire that's all criticisms of society. Entirely. The whole book is that. But it's presented in this satirical, comedic way that gives it a totally different feel. So both are negativity in some sense, but the emotions are very different, you know.
Sure, it's fine to distinguish the types.
Yeah.
For me, like I got my limits, and in terms of what I've read, and I suppose I have my preferences, but also my experiences, my observations, and I do feel like in my reading experience, and for me, I feel like a lot of what Nietzsche writes or has written, these were ideas I haven't encountered elsewhere. I feel like Nietzsche was the one introducing me to certain ideas and certain distinctions and to tell me about certain facts or stories. And for me, that was very valuable. And we probably might have talked about this last time, but maybe to some extent, I consider Nietzsche a sacrifice, like someone who like sacrificed, or maybe he might not have been intentionally a sacrifice of himself, but I feel like that might have been how his life turned out, where he lived this life of misery and eventually becoming insane, but writing all these very well written books in the process, with all these like very profound ideas. And obviously the books that he's written are reflecting the suffering of his own life. And so you can't really separate it from that to some extent. This is the creation that we have to work with. But you know, nevertheless, I actually wanted to do something else. So before this video started, we were talking about this, and you had said that Nietzsche said that the struggle had ended with Judea winning over Rome, like, permanently. And like it says that, like, in my version, like, it says that in this paragraph, but if we go to the next page, after the paragraph about Napoleon, Nietzsche says something very relevant, which indicates more of an eternal struggle. And I'd like to read the quote here. Section 17, was at the end of it, had the greatest of all conflicts of ideals been placed ad acta, disposed of for all time, or only adjourned, indefinitely adjourned? Must the ancient fire not someday flare up much more terribly, after much longer preparation? More, must one not desire it with all one's might, even will it, even promote it? Whoever begins at this point, like my readers, to reflect and pursue his train of thought, will not soon come to the end of it. Reason enough for me to come to an end, assuming it has long since been abundantly clear what my aim is. What the aim of that dangerous slogan is that is inscribed at the head of my last book, Beyond Good and Evil. At least this does not mean beyond good and bad. So,
How do you interpret that? Like, yeah.
I think he's anticipating the next Napoleon-like figure.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I
It's
feel like,
pretty accurate. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
so the next Napoleon-like figure did arise within due time, and another great war happened, and
Yeah.
so this could just happen again. We could just have another person like that. It might just keep happening.
Yeah.
We don't really know.
Yeah, I mean, you could interpret, I guess, like, I mean, it did happen, and Nietzsche kind of knew it was going to happen, and it's like, his suffering makes sense, because it's almost, yeah, like, he's suffering in anticipation for the, violence that's to come.
Yeah.
And yeah, maybe he did, that did need to happen. He was a sacrifice in some sense. But
right.
I wouldn't have wanted to be Nietzsche,
Sure.
So I wasn't trying to negate his existence either.
Mm-hmm.
He may have played like an important role. I think it's just more like, I hope I can find my happy place.
Sure.
I hope,
I'm like, to some extent I can, like, envy Nietzsche or like feel bad about not being as accomplished as him by my current age, but I know, like, if I have like a successful marriage and have children and successfully raise the children, and if I have good health, that in those ways that I would have a better life than Nietzsche, because those were things Nietzsche was lacking, and so I guess we have to be grateful for what we have, because you normally can't have it all. It's almost metaphysically impossible to have it all. So it's a bit, I'm not sure what else to say about that, but I think that could be a good closure almost for the first essay. But I guess one more note I'll add, at least, is the final paragraph of the first essay provides anticipation for the will to power. So I'll just start by reading the quote. Let me go back a little bit here. So, the well-being of the majority and the well-being of the few are opposite viewpoints of value. To consider the former, that is, the well-being of the majority, a priori of higher value, may be left to the naivety of English biologists. All the sciences have from now on to prepare the way for the future task of the philosophers. This task understood as the solution of the problem of value, the determination of the order of rank among values. And so this was something that he was writing in The Will to Power, and this was The Will to Power, in case you don't know, is basically like this unfinished book that was published as is in like a compiled way. was like a compilation of different notes that were still a bit scattered around the time of Nietzsche's insanity. And so one of the major purposes that Nietzsche was trying to pursue was this revaluation of all values and about the ordering of rank of values. And he was like trying to be very philosophically approach the concept of value and valuation. And he's already thought about the concept of value, and you can see even in this book, especially in the second essay. But he really wanted to tackle it at a more profound level later on, and that was something he was unable to do before he died. And maybe
but he had a solution.
I don't think he had a solution definitively. I feel like he was striving. He wanted a solution. I feel like he was working on it.
Do you think a solution exists?
I'm not sure, honestly. I'm not sure. You know, that might have been too great of a task. It's hard to say. But I still think about the concept of value, but in my humility, I have to accept that I don't really have a good answer or even a good philosophical analysis of it. But I would say this can conclude our coverage of the first essay, and I suppose we can move on to covering the second essay. So before we do that, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
No.
Okay. So the second essay, you know, on its face, it's about guilt and bad conscience, but to me, it meant a lot more to me than its title. So as Nate noted, there is, you know, like a praise of forgetfulness. And I wanted to make the point that I think this is valid because if you think about when you're happy, you're basically forgetting times that you're sad, or you're at least able to counterpose that. You're at least able to contrast that with the good. And like the more that I'm remembering the bad things that happened to me, basically the more depressed I would be. The more that I think about all the mistakes I made or all my regrets, you know, those are things that would make me less happy. So to some extent, being happy would be forgetting those things. You might say letting go, but I think forgetting would, you know, seem accurate as well. I don't know why it wouldn't, as at this moment. And then, you know, there's more to say about that for sure. Like he mentioned some guy named Mirabeau, and apparently Mirabeau could easily forgive everybody because he forgot so easily. People would just like insult him and stuff, and like he would just forget about it, and like he wouldn't care. And in a way that's strange, and I'm not even sure if it's true, but you know, if it is true, it does make it easy to forgive if you already forgot what someone did. And you know, I feel like there've been cases, at least one case in my life where that's happened. But the reason he even mentions forgetfulness is to come up with this idea that humans used to not have a great memory, and he's trying to argue that human memory was something that had to be forced over a very long period of time, like hundreds or thousands of years, basically through violent punishment. And he's saying that, you know, this violent punishment is not just something by the government or the equivalent of a government, but just also from creditor to debtor, and that people would take out loans or otherwise go into debts they could not pay off, and you know, one of the recourses that the creditor would have is to just inflict suffering on the debtor. And you know, he literally mentions like the cutting off of body parts and skin and things like that, and different types of punishments. And then Nietzsche generalizes crime as a way of, you know, like generating debt, accruing debt, and as punishment as a way of paying off that debt by being punished and suffering. And so there's more I want to say, but I want to kind of take a pause there on my end.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a pretty interesting and good idea. I mean, when I first was reading this and he talks about just like the domestication of man, I had never thought of that, you know, concept. I was like, that's pretty accurate. You know, you're literally like breeding breeding humans to domesticate them
Mm-hmm.
in the same way we do it with animals. But I think he's probably, he's like giving a totally accurate description of German society, probably a lot of European society for several hundred years or a few hundred years, before his time
Mm-hmm.
on this path. The only thing I would say though is like, I think this is a bit of a tangent, but like, Nietzsche's really, he lived in a bad time, and he's trapped within this time. Like the world wars were coming. He sensed all this repression and all this type of stuff. But at the same time, I do think it's not like I think things will change eventually. Because I think it won't, like human nature will even out, so like, and I think it's at least helpful to know that, it's like people haven't been permanently domesticated necessarily to this way. It may just be that there's like a certain government, certain like religious control, and then eventually these things will, there'll be war, and it'll eventually kind of even out, so it's not like a doomed sentence for all eternity. I think that's important to note too. Because in any culture, like European cultures, I think like all of them are struggling right now. All of them are struggling. But all of them have like really good aspects of their heritage, lots of things to be proud about. So eventually I think the bad things will fade away after a lot of destruction, and the positive seeds can continue to grow.
Right.
So I think it helps to know that. I think living when he did, and even living now, it's hard to know that. And it's easy to be scared of the destruction, but you don't want to have like a doomed attitude towards humanity in general. I think that's important.
Sure.
So that's all I'd say.
I mean, sometimes I literally tell myself that the earth is destined for destruction. Like, I think about like the garbage that we produce, and we're just adding to landfills, and garbage going into the oceans and the rivers, and all this stuff that we can't even recycle even if people put it in the recycling bins like they were supposed to, like stuff that we still could not recycle then, or compost, like these plastics, and then the emissions that we're generating. Like I'm not convinced that we're going to actually slow down emissions enough to prevent this global warming, assuming that global warming is caused by the emissions, which is plausible enough. I think either of that, like, I'm not convinced that we're going to prevent the world from flooding, or that we're going to prevent the garbage from piling up, and then we're not going to make more species extinct probably, or that species will come extinct anyway as consequences of these actions. So I expect more species to go extinct. I expect more land to be degraded and made useless, and the waters to be poisoned, and people to die in large numbers as a result of these consequences. Now, I don't think that would lead to the complete destruction of the human species. I just think it would be greatly reduced in number. So I think some number of people would still survive, and then there'd be such a great trauma from all these tragedies that, maybe they'd finally take things seriously and, as trivial as it sounds, like not use plastic so much, and like at least non-recyclable plastics.
That's largely like an American problem too, Other people from other countries come here and they're like, why do you use reusable stuff? It's so funny to me too, because especially some people, like, they always think there's a technological solution to everything. But it's like, consider that, it's like, how long have we had the technology of reusable plates and bowls. It's like we have the technology. There's just something in this fake economy that wants to use the disposable stuff, you know?
Yeah, it's very convenient. You know, I'm not sure how good these like compostable products are, to be honest. I'm not sure how compostable they really are. I don't claim to be an expert on that. But there's not much else I can say about it for now.
But I agree with you. Yeah. I think a lot of people. Well, he did mention the apocalypse of St. John at one point.
Oh, really?
I think that might have been in the first essay.
Oh, for the revenge of the weak against the strong.
Yeah, I think. Well, that was another thing I kind of totally disagree with Nietzsche about.
Okay.
Well, he said, the Apocalypse of John, the most wanton of all literary outbursts that vengefulness has on its conscience. And he says, one should not underestimate the profound consistency of the Christian instinct when it signed this book of hate with the name of the disciple of love, the same disciple to whom it attributed the amorous, enthusiastic gospel. There is a piece of truth in this, however much literary counterfeiting might have been required to produce it. Well, I mean, to his criticisms of Christianity, there has been a lot of literary counterfeiting, I think. And yeah, there's like examples where if you go back into history and you compare different traditions, you find that like the text actually was corrupted, or through translation, there were changes made. And of course, we know that there's like the Nicene Creed that agreed on different things, and there were people debating, and people had different perspectives, and one side won. So it's not to say that this is like the truth, So I think, my perspective, is most churches and they teach a doctrine that's very much at odds with what Jesus actually taught. And especially if they're teaching like obedience and all of these things that Nietzsche was criticizing, that's very much not who Christ was. He was flipping the tables of the money changers. He was like going all over the place. He was fearless. It's total contradiction, but of course they're doing that to control the masses, for their own power. This is nothing new, So I think his criticisms are valid. But yeah, but I disagree with just his, but I tend to think, like at least what like Jesus really taught was good teachings. I think some of those have been lost or corrupted, but and I also disagree with his perspective of the apocalypse. I think first of all, most people know it's a different John of Patmos.
Oh.
And second of all, I think it's actually, there's a very, very good chance it's like a true prophecy of what's to come. The destruction of America.
Like the new Babylon.
Babylon the Great.
Yeah. There's a lot we could say about that.
Once internal, the thing, all this climate change and all these things, like it's very scary, but it can't last forever, because the thing is, going hand in hand with all of these unsustainable practices is oppression of people, and there's like mounting mental health problems, mounting anger and rage, and some people just have all the power and other people don't. They're kind of slaves. So eventually, there's going to be internal risings. They're going to destroy this thing. A fake economy cannot last forever.
Right.
And yes, eventually, I don't know when it will be, but like if eventually when the government collapses due to infighting, once then you'll lose military power. And the book of Revelation, it's basically implies like the people who would destroy Babylon the Great are the Medes, that was like an area in modern day Iran. America's like fucked up the Middle East so much, and like if you look at what's happening in Palestine now, I mean it's just totally brutal and atrocious,
right,
and all that type of stuff. Like, yeah, that resentment's not gone anywhere, and they know, and they're like, well, there's a reason it's in the Bible. It says like another aspect of this sort of like bastardizing of the Bible and what Jesus taught, what the Old Testament taught, is just saying like, oh, everything is good, like God is nice, he just wants everybody to be happy. I mean, some sort of, but like, no, it says like the Lord God is a Lord of retribution. Everything must even out, there's no free lunch. So it's bound to happen,
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of negativity in the Bible, and even when I read the Bible, I prefer the negative parts, like Ecclesiastes and Job, and I guess that's why I'm most interested in reading Joshua, because it's about the conquest of Canaan, as they call it, stuff like that. I guess to some extent I'm repulsed by positivity, but I'm not sure what else to say. But yeah, I think I do think that rationally speaking, there is hope that we're not just gonna like completely die out from this stuff. I think a lot of people could die, but not everybody.
Yeah, I went on a tangent, but the original point I was gonna make was, a lot of people say like, oh, it's the end times or it's the end of the world, and I always think that's just a silly statement, because it's like, no, it's not like it's gonna end. It's so silly. And even the book of Apocalypse or Revelation, it says after these events there will be 1,000 years of peace. Yeah, the only end is the end of a certain way of life, certain culture, fake economy. And I mean, the world the world exists a certain way. It's not going to completely change overnight, but like, I think it will be much better, like you were saying.
Sure. I think people are so comfortable now that like they're not going to listen to the profound criticisms. So like we're probably not going to reform our financial system or our economy in the ways that I'm thinking until we have a super collapse, so that people are so down bad that we're like, okay, it's fine. Let's listen to the critics now. Let's take these criticisms and use them to design a better system. Because I think because we're so comfortable with the fake economy, people don't want to like ignore it. They don't want to stop the pleasure or comfort of the fake economy. So I think this is very separate from the original topic, but I don't really mind that much right now. I think this might be a good point to wrap up, actually, and maybe we'll save the rest of the second essay for later. So I'd say, or ask you if you have any other things you wanted to add.
No.
Okay. All right. So let me take a look here. I'm actually nearsighted, in case you didn't know. So I think we're at a reasonable point at the 53-minute mark here. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for watching. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Please be tuned in for the next part of the Nietzsche Book Club. Goodbye.
Sure.